Good morning. Welcome to the first session of the Global Law School Summit on the present and future of global legal education. In this session, first we will be introducing our distinguished panelists and the session theme, followed by the panel discussion and the audience Q&A. For this session, we are honored to have here with us five distinguished panelists. We have Professor Simon Bronitt, who is Dean of Law School at the University of Sydney, Australia. Professor Tan Cheng-Han is the Dean of School of Law at the City University of Hong Kong. And Professor Ioannis Panoussis is the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Université Catholique de Lille, France. Professor Yubaraj Sangroula is the Executive Director of the Kathmandu School of Law, Nepal. Professor Michael Stuckey is the Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Tasmania, Australia. And I'm Arpita Gupta. I'm a Professor of Law and an Associate Dean of Research at Jindal Global University, and I'll be moderating this session. The theme of this session is What is Global? The concept of global in global legal studies. In this session, we will be discussing the fundamental underpinnings of the concept of global, that is, what is the meaning and implication of the term global in the context of global legal studies. The term globalization is laden with competing meanings and transcends the temporal spatial dimensions of interconnectedness. From Wallerstein's world systems model to Castell's proposition of a networked society mapped through flows of capital, technology, and information, the term has evolved and can often be infused with ideological meaning. Another framing of globalization is girded by the perpetuation of unequal power relations on a global scale and views globalization as a new liberal and bourgeois hegemony which legitimates an exploitative system. Though the term globalization can invoke sharp ideological positions split across the political spectrum, it is important to adopt a nuanced perspective that considers the ways in which globalization enables flows of knowledge and interconnectedness while remaining critical of the global power structures that it operates within. Simon Chesterton divides the global world order for the sake of understanding interconnectedness in the context of the legal education into three phrases. First, internationalization. Second, transnationalization. And third, globalization. Chesterton states that the world has moved from archipelago to patchwork to web, both in the sense of the rise of the internet as well as in the sense that commercial and other activities do not simply overlap at the edges but may be structurally and inextricably linked. Helming the innovative NYU at NUS program at the time of writing, that is in 2009, Chesterton considers the politics of a global legal pedagogy while simultaneously ruminating on the nature of a global legal education and the education necessary to prepare legal students for global lawyering. While reflecting on global legal pedagogies, Silver identifies three complications. First, the local nature of law that resist globalizing trends seen in other fields. Second, differing legal opportunities for lawyers in different countries. And third, the differing role of lawyers in society in different countries. For instance, American lawyers are often involved in policy making and politics, which is not the case in every country. Such complications, therefore, make a uniform global legal education model a unique prospect to imagine and implement. Silver offers the model of global legal literacy, defined as one that includes elements of language and cultural fluency, as well as understanding differences in the roles of law and lawyers in the national context. Chesterton also looks at hegemonic reproductions of knowledge, especially with US-Asian law school partnerships, stating that it can be argued that what is occurring is not so much globalization as Americanization. This is also partly accurate, reflecting the US dominance in the practice of law and its cultural influence more globally and generally. For a truly global partnership, the important underlying principle should be premised on ensuring that there is not a simple export of American ideas, but a genuine engagement that is conscious of global hegemonic power. Now, with this background, I would invite our panelists to deliberate upon some of the key questions on the session theme. The first question for the panel is actually a two-part question. First one, that is part one, how do you define the term global? And part two, in your view, what are some of the positives and negatives of the global world we inhabit today? Professor Bronitt, Professor Sangroula.
Well, I'll happily kick off the opportunity to begin the discussion. So first of all, thank you, Vice Chancellor President Raj Kumar. Delighted to be able to reflect on some of these questions. And I hope I have something that will be useful to inform the discussion. So first, I'm here, and the screensaver behind me is the situation of our law school, which is part of our new law building, which is located on the lands of our First Nations people of Gadigal, and I pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging. And I think that in some ways is a good way to start, because it's so important to recognise the global and the universal in the context of the local and the particular. And there is always a danger when we talk about universality that we snuff out the importance of local place, history, culture, and in our case, unresolved questions of sovereignty of First Nations peoples. So any concept of global, for me, has to be one that accommodates that local context. And even the tendency to assume, and I'm English and I traveled to Australia in 1990 to start as a young lecturer at ANU. I knew nothing about Australia. I knew nothing about its history. I didn't even know it was a federation. I was 25 and I arrived to teach a system of law that I knew really very little about. Of course, it was common law and therefore assumed to be broadly similar. But of course, what you learn very quickly is that things may have a similar form, but the substance becomes very different, shaped by the history, needs, and context. So that informs my idea of globalization, which is really, I think that critique, Arpita, you identified and drew out with Simon, the other Simon's conception, is the concern about of universalism really being a Western liberal hegemony. And that's not always such a bad thing if you're exporting the concept of the rule of law. There are some limitations behind the concept, but there are some really positive aspects of constraining tyranny and arbitrariness that I think many of us, liberal is not a dirty word. It might embody a particular place and time, but liberalism per se is not inherently to be rejected on the grounds that it takes freedom as important. I think most people do think that's important, but it may be not the defining and limiting concept. So universality does entail a concept that ideas like justice, law, rule of law can be imposed upon different places and cultures unproblematically. And if you look at the international law and the UN, they tend to adopt that position of exporting universal codes, which I've, on the record, have been quite critical of some of that universalism. Bill Twining, or William Twining, the legal theorist, in his work on globalization, adopts, in his preference to globalization, cosmopolitanism. And this is the idea, and even scholars like Jeremy Bentham in a much earlier period favored his cosmopolitan outlook on law. He recognized there was some element of the way in which laws, rules, people travel around, and they change in that process of traveling. So his universal codes, Bentham loved codes, he wanted to export them, but he recognized the content had to be adjusted to the local conditions. And so the codes of India would not be the same as the codes of Canada or Australia. So I think I favour not the global law school, but perhaps one which is more cosmopolitan. That sounds very stylish and fashionable. And as the son of a tailor, maybe that's a good thing, that we should have an idea that we draw our inspirations from many places, not a single reductionism of universalism. So that's probably my reflection, in a sense, recognising the limits of the concept of the global in legal education. But I certainly, in my own journey, traveling, visiting India and spending time living and working in Hong Kong, as well as in Canada, all being part of that cosmopolitan opportunity to absorb legal ideas. And I really think it's an important part of a good legal education, and we should be encouraging as much of that as possible.
Thank you, Professor Bronitt. Professor Sangroula.
Thank you very much, Professor Arpita. This question is very simple, in fact. It's very difficult for professors to answer what is this. Traveling many countries and traveling many universities and visiting many universities, what I feel is like I become more and more confused and more actually blurred. What does this globalization mean? We read a lot of literature, approaching from different perspectives, politics, law, business, transactions, and all this kind of thing. They really make me particularly more confused. And sometimes I confront certain very controversial issues. So what I better feel easier, feel more comfortable, is to understand more working type of definitions for me, because I cannot talk globalization for all. That's my perception now. So I can think what globalization probably means to me. And in that sense, what I say is like, neither it is totally possible to perceive, nor it is totally possible to communicate in a right way. So there are two very small problems, but very far-reaching in consequence. Neither I can fully put them in my mind, nor I can properly communicate them. And then, in that sense, what I often say is like, forget what other thinks about it. My sphere is legal education. So I should stick within the legal education, and I should start thinking from the perspective of the legal education. And looking from that perspective, what is global then for me is, I immediately jump and look into the technology, internet, telecommunications, various different forms of computer technology. And what I think right now we have been doing here. I am 55 kilometers out of Kathmandu, on the top of the hill with 130 students, and they are quite busy in doing this community work over there. I'm on the top of the hill in our small center, and there is an internet, and there is communication systems here, and I'm sitting in front of the laptop, as we were instructed to open laptop, yes? So I'm before the laptop. What is this for me? Sure, immense, impact you can see. This technology has compressed the time and compressed the space. So you are speaking from Delhi, I am in Shabab, Nepal. Professor Simon is speaking from Australia, so we are together. The space is compressed so nicely, and the time. So I was quite afraid that my internet may go anytime, and then I will be just away. So time is totally, we are free to connect with each other, because we don't wait to buy a ticket, airlines after 2 days and 2 days flight and coming to Sydney and going to hotel. So we are completely free. I click, I reach to you. One freedom. Second freedom, we have become so small. And what we have been doing right now here, but this working definition is like, Simon is telling what he means, globalization, and I'm talking what globalization means. And therefore we are enriching our perspectives. There are definitely some controversies also, what I often encounter. And these controversies sometimes are composed of very critically and very reflectively if I speak. I want to teach something very good of United States, but that law is not applicable in my country. I want to do business in Australia in the way that I am supposed to do, but Australian law is there. Sure, our laws and our regulations are territorial, but our communications have gone beyond the territories. So that's a controversy. So for me, to be very precise, what does globalization means to me is to work together, develop a system, develop mechanism, develop technology so that we start working together, particularly in the legal education sphere, to make a new understanding of law. Therefore, to end this part, what I say is that globalization in terms of legal education, again, example, is a part of the globalization of legal system that works in all territories. If we understand that way, then again, using my previous theory, compression of time and compression of space, I think globalization in the sector of legal education is what I understand is a process of making a global learning of law and global dissemination of law. So it is globalization of law and it is globalization of education both. So that's how I am trying to simplify myself to understand, because if I read all concepts that you also narrated in all this book, I really get confused. So I have stopped reading them. I try to understand from myself, from my perspective. That's that much for this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sangroula. Now I would invite Professor Panoussis to give his inputs and insights.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really happy to meet all of you today. So I think that I agree with the two previous speakers, naturally. If we understand global as being uniform, this would be a huge problem for me. So I prefer to understand global as being the idea of plural. I introduced the idea of plural when speaking about global and globalization in legal studies. And the pluralistic approach takes into account local, regional, national, continental specificities. It is very important to develop a sort of a global conscience when we teach law and when we discuss globalization through law, and not having, and I'm the European of the group, not having a European and Eurocentric approach, or not having an Occidental approach. This would be really the most problematic thing. Developing a global conscience is understanding others, trying to conceive, or at least to agree on the existence of standards, but not impose uniformity concerning implementation. And there has to be a difference. This is what you were just exposing, saying that there is a difference in space and time, and we have to take it into account. And we're going to try through the means that we are going to use, at least to reduce the space and the time, the kilometers that are between us. Naturally, the positive is the idea of this global conscience. For example, new lawyers developing a way of thinking law and practicing law, which introduces differences, cultural, historical, economical, social, etc. The negative aspect, and we can read it in a big part of the doctrine, is the idea that what I call pluralistic approach, others call it relative approaches of law. And I'm an optimistic guy, so I prefer to consider that pluralist is something rich and relative is something poor. So I prefer richness than poorness. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Panoussis. Professor Stuckey.
Thanks very much. I've been listening with such interest to our colleagues, and I hope I can add a few reflections and build upon some of those ideas a little bit anyway. And I think about these kind of sessions, and I don't know if the metaphor is a good one, but for those people who enjoy jazz music, where where the band is playing together, but everybody gets the opportunity to develop their little solo piece. But at the same time, we're still all in together and understanding that. I think we've started with a good introduction from Professor Bronitt to talk about a liberal conception, and I want to reflect on that a little bit, and you know, I hate to say it, but maybe add a little darker side to that. Is it correct to call it a liberal mindset now, or are we really talking about a neoliberal mindset? And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, but I can see a few people nodding and thinking, maybe. And is that the same as an American approach? And that was part of our introduction. I don't think it is actually, but I do think it's a Western. I do think it's an Occidental approach. And let me give a little example of what I mean by that. And Simon also mentioned, you know, rule of law. You know, great thing. You know, we shouldn't underestimate the value of that. But we might then ask in this context, whose rule of law? Which rule of law? Is there just one rule of law? Or are we now in a globalized world where, for example, a newly and developing Chinese concept of rule of law in international relations is a competing idea? That's just one example for that. I think there are, of course, positives and negatives, and Professor Sangroula mentioned some fantastic positives, a kind of equality through technology, the opening up of some freedoms through the use of technology. And I don't think we can deny that that's something that we've realised, and particularly over the last 2 years. But then we also have to question, at what cost do those freedoms come? What do we sacrifice? What do we lose in those freedoms? Is the use of technology in some way, although connecting us better, making those connections perhaps more superficial or maybe not so deep because of their instant effect? I don't know. I just raised that. I raised that question, but a positive nonetheless, for sure. Well, negative things. Well, I mean, where can you start? There's so many people who've spoken about some of the negative aspects of the neoliberal concept of global legal education. I suppose the biggest part of that is, and it's well written about, the corporatization of universities around the world, the commodification of knowledge, that they really are the central features of those ideas. But I now leave off and let my colleagues develop on those. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Stuckey. Professor Tan.
Well, thank you for invitation. The good thing about going last is that you can leverage off the wisdom of what others have said, so I can keep my response relatively brief, I think. I would say that perhaps I can respond to the first part of the question in this way. I think broadly and in the context of law schools, I would say that being global is to kind of see the law school as providing a window to the legal world beyond the domestic context. And and it reminds me that sometime around 2005, when I was dean at NUS Law, I sort of conceived the idea of the school being Asia's global law school. And checking the NUS Law website, I see that that's very much how NUS Law continues to brand itself, right? And so what did I sort of mean by this? I think for me at least, it's a recognition that so much of law is driven by the unique circumstances of each jurisdiction, but yet that understanding this rich diversity can give us useful insights into our own realities, right? I want to stress that, right? Our own realities. So I don't see globalization as something uniform, as Ioannis mentioned. I quite agree with that. Or nor is it a blind acceptance of Western or other norms, but really a help to what are good practices that we can adopt given our own context and cultures. And I think that's important, right? It's got to be a discerning acceptance, a discerning learning process. In relation to the second part of the question, I'm an optimist, and on the whole, I think that globalization is positive for the world. You know, there can never be enough mutual understanding and cooperation, and a certain degree of interdependence, of course, enhances these. The law of comparative advantage is also better realized in a global environment. And, you know, such an environment also facilitates global responses to some of the really huge problems that we face today. Now, this doesn't, of course, mean that it'll be easy to arrive at the right solutions. And I admit that larger states will often be tempted to exercise some degree of hegemony, as we also see today. But, you know, I would like to think that this is really the case even in a non-globalized environment. A globalized environment arguably places greater stress on the environment and resources, but one could say that the real cause for this is development and human greed rather than just globalization. I think we just have to learn to develop more sustainably, and I don't think placing the blame on globalization is necessarily, you know, the right thing to do all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tan. And so moving on to the next question for the panel, that is, how much can global capture the complexities, uncertainty and unpredictability of global society? So I think we can again start with Professor Simon Bronitt.
Well, can I pass on that one and see if someone else wants to? It's a bit like University Challenge. You probably don't know that old British university. You don't know, you just say pass or mastermind. But look, I'd much rather hear from someone else actually who has got some thoughts on that particular question. So pass.
May I join? I would be very much happy to share a couple of my ideas. Like again, connecting to my previous metaphor kind of thing. What I look is like globalization is an opportunity. Should we move with optimism? If you stand in the opportunities, in the optimism, the uncertainty becomes very clear. And what is this uncertainty that I often speak about is like, we have businesses across the world. That means these big businesses have been inviting people to go different parts of the world by communication, by virtually like this, or physically in any form. Therefore, we have to interact with each other. But there are two uncertainties, or rather I say it's a challenge, is that state systems are still in disconnections, and this disconnection is rife. We have systems differences. Some kind of patriotism also is there. My system is better than other system, or at least my system should be functional is a kind of quest. One. Second very important thing what we face is like, we have a history. We have a history of the colonialism, many other wars and other. So people, despite all these big educations and coming together, there's some prejudices. If not prejudices, at least some doubts are there. Sure, we fail to be optimistic, and we often drive by our own centric system, and we become doubtful. This is what is the biggest challenge. I say the uncertainty, but what I think is like my impression is that Nepal has a very short history of legal education. We had a very feudal type of legal education. We changed the legal education. It's 22 years before with the post-establishment of Kathmandu School of Law, like India did, Bangalore Law School long time before. In 22 years, we have changed the landscape of the legal education in Nepal. And how did we do? It's not our production. We learned from Harvard, we learned from Oxford, we invited people, we shared with them, we got clinical programs. And what I often say is like, we have a plate that is universal for me, that is global. I can go with this plate to Australia, I can go with this plate to Hong Kong, anywhere, but the food might be different. Okay. So for me, plate is globalization. What is the problem of my society the law has to address, and the people coming from other parts of the world to do the business should be addressed that too. So that food is relative. So what my understanding is like, globalization does not fully reject the localism also. That actually imbibes in it. So respect to all local systems without prejudice and pride is in fact a globalization, again, in terms of legal education. That's my perception. So I don't see uncertainties and very big. And I say many challenges have been very successfully addressed by globalization and legal education, at least.
Thank you, Professor Sangroula, for the optimistic take on the question of unpredictability and uncertainty. Professor Tan.
I must confess that I've found this question quite difficult because it does assume to some extent that there is a global society, and I'm not quite certain that there is something that we would necessarily call a global society, even though I admit that the world is getting smaller and there is certainly a lot, and we're certainly a lot closer to each other now than we ever were, right? But maybe my take would be this. My sense is that having at least a global mindset, being open, being more understanding of the legal perspectives of other jurisdictions can really only help us to better understand other societies, and therefore, in a sense, help us to better manage at least legal disputes and the uncertainty and unpredictability that can arise in the world at large. But it takes the mindset of having mutual respect and openness. And therefore, I think that law academics and law schools, insofar as we can continue to collaborate more and more, can really help this global conversation to take place in a constructive environment. I mean, one of the areas I work in, for example, is the law of agency. And of course, I'm very much a common lawyer, but I like to look at what civilian systems do in the law of agency. And I remember the first time I looked at the German civil code, I was quite amazed that, in my view, the Germans have got quite a few things done much better than we have in the common law system. And I think that's really the kind of attitude we should bring when we enter into these global conversations about law, to really to be respectful, to have an open mind, and really want to learn about other systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tan. Professor Stuckey, your reflections on the question.
Yeah, I found this question difficult as well, but and I hate feeling like I'm the bad guy all the time here. But I think we have to be a little bit wary about these kind of questions as well, because we often see examples of the kind of challenges, and here it's referred to as uncertainties and unpredictabilities, but I'll call them challenges, more and more mediated through a kind of economic and rational way of resolving issues, and by that I mean through a context of always reductions in government spending, the idea of austerity, ideas about always focusing upon a kind of market productivity response to complexity. And I suppose that was one of the risks about the sacrifice or the potential costs of these things. So, maybe I'm the other side of the coin here from the optimistic point of view, which Professor Sangroula was putting, and I respect that. But when I see these issues addressed, it's often in those kind of very kind of harsh terms, and that concerns me.
Thank you, Professor Stuckey. Professor Panoussis.
Thank you. I will be short because I totally agree with the point of view of Professor Tan on this fact. If we assume that there is a global society, then there is a difficulty. But I don't consider that there is a global society as such. I consider that we are trying through global to develop what I called in my definition this global conscience. And global conscience is the capacity to have these standards that guide us as lawyers, but also to take into account the local approach, the regional approach, the specificity. If you don't do so, then you are unable to have an effective approach of law. So I consider it as Professor Tan said, that we have to take what's better and to say, what is happening somewhere else? How can I inspire my system and the system within which I am actually through the best things that I saw in another system? And this comparative positive approach offers a positive approach of globalization. And I want to stay optimistic. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I had some experiences in my life which are extremely interesting. The most exciting and interesting experience I had was in Afghanistan. I went for a human rights week, we were calling it, and everybody was telling me, be careful, you are the European, you are the Occidental, nobody will understand and nobody will agree with what you're going to say. And effectively, if I try to say to Afghani people, I was in 2013, you should do like this, I would lose. But we began discussing principles, and we agreed in all principles concerning human rights. The difficulty was the local application, the national application in a specific context, religious context, military context, etc., etc. But everybody was agreeing. We have to protect life. We have to protect against torture. We have to protect private life. And we see that the standards are common, but the application in time and the space cannot. If we understand that, once again, we are richer. If not, we are poorer. So I prefer to stay optimistic and continue saying we offer the capacity through globalization to everyone to do better tomorrow. And this is what we have to take into account.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Panoussis. The next question for the panel is, what are the main tenets of a global law school and global legal studies? And I think we can start with Professor Sangroula.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to be very precise for this. Like, what kind of global law schools tenets? I see two basic structure here. This two basic structure is like, one is globalization in legal education. That is that we're trying to be more inclusive and more interdisciplinary. We're trying to learn, just for example, from another country's law schools and strengthen the curricula, pedagogy, and also methods on the one way. So that process is something like running like a webs everywhere. Might be Czechoslovakia is learning from Nepal, Australia is learning from Papua New Guinea, and all these kind of things are there. That's one way where all this positive aspect is there. There is another trend. Another trend in globalization, what I see is like the rising lead of American legal education across the world. And there are two trends. One, many American legal education contents which reflects more policy, and doing that, it also brings the politics, policy, strategy, and law also to other countries, and there where sometimes resistance occurs. And that is where like some of my colleagues before already hinted about that. That's one. Let me give just a very brief example. Like multinational corporations have been going to many parts from United States. They need American lawyers. So how they do address that need is like they bring people from other countries, train in American legal system, and send them back to work. And then there is a contextuality problem. So the question is like, basic tenets is right now, which dominates a kind of hegemonic also in that sense, is the transplant of American legal education system in many parts of the world. But the cooperation among many law schools to work together, do research together, find out the problems and sharing the methods, in this part, we are very much lagging still. I mean, this kind of platforms, we are just limited, but students have very, very less opportunities for that. Some moot courts and other kind of thing have helped a little bit, but still What is the TNET basically is globalization is traveling across the world, but the globalization in the name of emerging lead up American legal education in the world is traveling past. So that is where is all these problems are there. We have to discuss more and find out the way. That's my take.
Thank you, Professor Sangroula. So your statements actually resonate with Galanter and Trubeck's article, the classic article, Scholars Itself, Estrangement, where the critique of American legal liberalism was elaborated upon. So thank you, Professor Sangroula.
Just a minute, also recently, a very good article by Duncan Kennedy from Harvard Law School is fabulous in this regard.
Oh, thank you. Professor Bronitt, your views on the third question.
I've worked in a number of law schools in Australia, and obviously my own experience, many 35 more years than I want to remember back in the UK as a student. But look, most law schools are pretty parochial, frankly, particularly at undergraduate level, because they're trying to achieve, to meet the local professional requirements for admission. And that's, one of the things that every global law school also has a huge amount of local content, which is non-negotiable. And it's upon that platform really then if you like, the elective and postgraduate curriculum is built. So it is quite possible, particularly in a law school like our own, where the elective choices are quite constrained, because my colleagues believe you can't be schooled as a lawyer in Australia, or more specifically New South Wales, without doing all these additional compulsories. They only have a handful of choices at the end to do the more adventurous and sometimes very global. I mean, we have a Himalayan field trip mobility program. We've, some of the oldest mobility programs to Shanghai and Beijing, and also to the UK and more conventional places. So students can always get a taste on a 2-week experiential program. And I've led a few to Indonesia in my previous university, UQ, and also to China. So a global law school often has an essence of globalization thrown in the upper years. What I'm quite excited about is actually the options of pathway programs, where students can complete their undergraduate law degree or their JD, and then get credit from their elective program to then go off and do do an LLM somewhere else. And that really, those kind of dual programs, I think, are really attractive, because I think the reality is you can't do much in a couple of weeks. It's a sampler. You're not going to get a real appreciation of I think there's a great value in it. I greatly enjoy the opportunities and the relationships you build, but we all know it's, and I've had students who've spent a year in India and based at Jindal and elsewhere, but doing real projects and working for judges, writing articles on the substance of the law. They come out really understanding the Indian legal system in the way that a 2-week program couldn't. So I think what does global legal studies mean to me? Well, you can't escape the local. It's good to have partners and friends. So you can't, just building in courses with the word global in them, being taught by people in a very superficial way is probably not what you should be doing. You can't achieve it all in an undergraduate program. So you probably need to be encouraging, where possible, opportunities to spend a semester overseas and get that deep knowledge. And many of our students do in Australia take up the exchange programs. But interesting, law schools are not very open to that. There's actually quite a lot of barriers we experience. They law students often do the exchange in their other degree rather than the law school. So law schools can be a bit of part of the problem to a genuinely cosmopolitan legal education. Yeah, so look, I think there's some reflections on that question.
Thank you, Professor Bronitt. And now we can have Professor Tan.
Yes, thank you. So my sense of what a global law school and global legal studies entail is to first of all have faculty, academic faculty who are alive to developments and ideas elsewhere, and then in a sense we incorporate some of these perspectives to a greater or lesser degree into their teaching and research. And to have students also be more exposed and more aware of different legal cultures and approaches. So when I was teaching at NUS, I used to say to my students that the majority of jurisdictions belong to the civil law tradition and not the common law tradition, right? And that some of our largest trading partners, take Indonesia, take China, take Japan, and Korea, are all strongly influenced by the civil law tradition. And so given that Singapore is kind of like a small and mature economy, it's really important to have our students get a broader understanding of what law is. And so we really tried to enhance the range of electives to give our students exposure, especially selectively to certain aspects of the law in China, in India, in Malaysia, and Indonesia, which are our major trading partners, or our most important major trading partners. We also tried, and it's always difficult, as Simon put it, to try to fit things into the core curriculum, but we also did try to fit one core subject into the curriculum that focused on comparative law, particularly the civil law tradition. And exchange programs also help. Fortunately, at NUS, lots of our students did want to go to another law school overseas, including in China, which was very helpful. And so, perhaps some of this actually helped them, because a good number of NUS graduates today do a lot of Asian-related work. And now that I'm with CityU in Hong Kong, to my great pleasure and surprise, I've actually met a number of my former students who do a lot of work in Hong Kong advising Chinese clients. So perhaps something worked along the way, although I'm not sure what or why. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Tan. Professor Stuckey, your views on the third question.
Thanks. I have a few ideas about this, and I hope for a change I'll be a bit positive about this. We have such fantastic students. We're really privileged to teach students. When they come to us, they are full of imagination, full of energy, and I really kind of hope that by the end of the curriculum we haven't beaten all of that out of them and put them in boxes. But seriously, we have a resource in our students. I think we're starting to realise how we can really muster that and work with that in an exciting kind of a way. There is always a risk, and the other speakers have mentioned this, about when we try to approach things in a curriculum sense, there's always a risk that things get compartmentalized, that that kind of experience is not horizontally integrated in a way which is a much more effective way of approaching questions like globalization. And it's not the only one. I mean, environmental issues would be another one. Indigenization would be another really important one for us to consider. Now, all of these things can work together in a way that drives the energy and the imagination of our students in the kind of ways that they want to go. So I actually think this is quite an exciting idea. But we always have to ask ourselves, where are those things in our institutional strategies? Are they even there? And where are they in our research? And if they are there, are they compartmentalized? Or, as I've suggested, I think a much better idea is that they're threaded through in this holistic kind of a way. That's what's going to capture the imagination of our students, and that should be our focus, in my point of view.
Thank you, Professor Stuckey. Professor Panoussis, your views on the third question.
Thank you. Naturally, if we want to be a global law school, I think that we have to educate our students in order to be open-minded students. And how do we offer them this possibility? Is to understand and to study cultural diversity and differences. And in order to be open-minded like this, we have to offer them the opportunity to travel, but also we have to bring the world at home. We have to have a sort of cosmopolitan approach of the world, I think, and of law, and also a critical approach of the law. We mentioned Kennedy a few minutes ago. It's extremely interesting to introduce that to students. What I really like to do, especially with our master students in international law, is to take, for example, chapters of international law, and at the same moment offer the opportunity for this course, for this chapter, to have the European, French vision, the American vision, and also the Chinese or the Indian or some. So 2-3 visiting professors coming, discussing, and we can see that we are talking about the same thing, but through different means or different paths, we arrive generally to the same conclusion. But the path is different, and we have to understand this path. This is cultural diversity. We have to bring the world at home is also offering a big place, a big space to foreign professors, to professors and practitioners, because this is also extremely important. And practitioners bring also the reality of the field, what is really happening in the field, and students can develop some approaches which are extremely interesting here. One of the most important experiences we develop in Lille, in our university, in our faculty, is the master class on global actors for peace. I don't know if you ever heard about that, but the idea this year, the theme was beyond the West and the rest. So we were trying to explain to students how finally, when you discuss peace, you should leave this Eurocentric approach of peace, which can be considered as neocolonial, and offer the opportunity to African, to Asian, to South American, to discuss through their own history these kind of questions. And if you understand history, if you have a critical approach of what you are doing at home, then you can offer them the possibility to be really global when they are going to be lawyers in a few years.
Thank you, Professor Panoussis. So the discussion for this question was extremely productive. We actually saw a number of strategies such as dual pathway or dual degree programs, and inviting visiting professors, designing programs such as Beyond West and the Rest. So this was extremely helpful. Moving on to the next question for the panel. The next question is, how do we adopt a global legal pedagogy? So this is interconnected with the third question. So I think, Professor Panoussis, we can start with you. Any thoughts on the fourth question?
It's a continuity of what I was just saying. We have to invite scholars and practitioners from all around the world. This is something extremely important. I began my research with Inter-American standards, and I was so surprised to discover things that never in my university I was taught. And I was saying, why we are not doing so? And if you discuss in human rights reparation through the American system of protection of human rights, it's huge. It's extremely interesting. And when we brought it in Europe, a lot of people used it, even the European Court of Human Rights, and they were saying, wow, we lost 20 years of capacities to go further. So introducing visiting scholars, introducing courses, regional law, sub-regional legal culture, etc. How do we do it? Through different courses that we are going to put in our curricular, and we have a lot of examples like here. And then you were mentioning dual degrees, double degrees, common degrees. I think that this is one of the future of law and of global law studies. Naturally, we have to continue offering possibilities for mobility to the students. So I just leave for a semester or for a year. But the tool to understand better the world and to become a global lawyer is to develop this kind of things. And this is a part also of our strategy in Lille, and with the US, with Russian universities. Tomorrow, I hope with Jindal, as we are under discussion. And I consider that using this kind of tools is the possibility to go further in the global legal pedagogy. And I would like to come back also to what Professor Sangroula was saying at the beginning. I think that here, using internet, using the new means, using technology, hybrid online as means to introduce diversity, we are really rich. These 2 years it was suffering, COVID, but also capacities to understand how this kind of tools can offer us the possibility to reduce space in a way we never thought before. And this, we have to keep the best of this period. Naturally, we suffered, as I said, but we have to keep the best. And one of the best is that, to continue communicating easily through this kind of means in order to develop this global legal pedagogy once again.
Thank you, Professor Panoussis. Professor Tan, what are your thoughts on the fourth question?
Well, you know, I must confess that the whole idea of a global legal pedagogy is quite a difficult one because, you know, there's so much that we need to do in the time that our students are with us. And I think it's not really quite possible to do this in the full sense of the word. So my approach generally has been to ensure that our curriculum will expose students to meaningful perspectives outside the domestic jurisdiction so that they can, and I think this is important, so that they can better understand their own jurisdiction and their own law. And so maybe what I can do is take an example. So at CityU, where I am at the moment, many students are actually exposed to aspects of Chinese law, which is a mix of social legal theory, civil law, and even common law, particularly from the United States. And I find that this broadens the perspectives of students beyond the common law, and it's very useful for future practitioners because of the continued integration of Hong Kong into the Greater Bay Area. You know, I think we can't bring the whole world to our students, but we can have some focus on selected jurisdictions that are likely to be of relevance to them in future, while at the same time giving them a fuller appreciation of domestic law.
Thank you, Professor Tan. Professor Stuckey.
Thanks. I'll try and be brief. I think when we're talking about pedagogy, we're talking about techniques, and we're talking about systems of techniques. And I think what we need to focus on a lot more and a lot more consciously is about design, about what are our purposes, what are our motives in achieving, and what design we use. But traditionally, we've always been very focused on content. And, you know, we can't ignore content for some of the reasons Professor Bronitt was talking about earlier in a very frank way. But, you know, we can't allow content to control us. We should be controlling it. And we've got to feed in our ideas around technique and technology into that very purposefully and you know, in a way which is open to continuous reform as we learn along the way. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Stuckey. Professor Sangroula, your views on the fourth question.
Thank you again. Actually, I do agree with Professor Tang generally, and I would just very briefly refer to model, and then I probably can say better, okay? We have one model of system of legal education, basically, which involves review of American legal policy and judicial culture, which we basically know the clinical model. This is one model that we have largely been using in many parts, despite so many other innovative ideas. The one model that we use, probably Professor Simon knows very well, that Kathmandu School of Law and Sydney University do, that's called Himalayan PhD School Program. It's for last 9 years we have been doing. 30 students come from Sydney and we involve 10 students from Nepal. And we take them to far away in a project site, okay? We take them in the project site, big project sites, which are funded by World Bank, IMF, and many others, even government, bilateral donations and other. And we engage the students over there in multifaceted way. We ask them to find out sociology. We ask them to find out the legal culture, the conflicts and everything. We engage them to debate with the people and there are two professors, very good friend of mine, and David Kinley and Ben Schul, they come here with a couple of other assistants, and we discuss a lot. So what pedagogy that now I propose is like, let's blend this law and development approach, community participating pedagogy with the clinical model. I think we can make the best pedagogy. That's all what I would like to say at this point.
Thank you, Professor Sangroula. Professor Bronitt.
We love our program with working with the Kathmandu Law School. Although I'm a new dean, 2.5 years in the role, it's such a highlight of the students that participate, and they all talk about its transformative effect. It's not because they go and learn about Nepalese law. I think it just transforms the way they think about law and justice and the practice of law. And that in its sense is so incredibly powerful. So, you know, we're committed to that and want to expand those programs. How we do that is within that clinical experiential space is really important. But coming back to the idea of pedagogy, and Michael made the point, it's really about, you know, what are the tools that we're using to engage in this exciting, you know, cosmopolitan legal education. And it occurred to me that, yes, technology is really important, not only for linking us up, and we're doing that here. It's just fantastic that we can have these conversations, and we weren't doing this as much in earlier times, but I did have an experience of working with my colleagues in the 1990s, 1997, with my colleagues in Canada, and we pioneered a course that was co-designed. And I think co-design is really important. So this course was a course at ANU. It was a course also at UBC and UVic, and it was called Comparative Legal History. And I taught it with Ian Holloway, who's now the Dean at Calgary, and John McLaren, who's now retired, very distinguished Canadian, and Wes Pugh, who sadly passed away. These are amazing colleagues, much younger versions of each of us were doing it. And we got funding from the Canadian government to do this on a new platform called WebCT. We were the only WebCT course. We were the first, actually. And we set it up and taught globally. And you know, it's wonderful that we've actually got the technology. This cost a fortune to do. We had a huge grant from the Canadian government to do it. And I remember even joining up the students in the 3 universities, and it cost nearly $10,000 to essentially hire a satellite to do it. We can do all of that at low cost, but the question is, are we doing it now? You know, one of the interesting things, we have the technology available, we can co-design courses, but we're not actually doing that. And I'm wondering whether that's, if we're looking towards a global legal pedagogy, that we should be not only doing this, you know, in these experiential courses where we take a group of students to ECPOL or India or Nepal. We should be thinking about co-designing the courses, bringing young lecturers together, as we were nearly, God my God, 25 years ago, and really encouraging them to think about right from the beginning designing these courses and embedding them in our curriculum. And we've got curriculum review next year. It's our own review. It's not imposed on us by the university or the profession. And these are some of the questions I think we want to ask about our global experiential programs and how we ensure the next generation of academics. David and I are the same vintage. And you know, we need to excite the next generation of young scholars to take those formative experiences and continue to develop these courses. So that would be my thought, is really about co-design. I mean, I'm borrowing Michael's term there. Co-design is really important, and that will avoid the, you know, sometimes the superficial comparative law we can do with the 1-hour guest lecture from the German scholar on the totality of German law. I think if we can co-design things, embed them right from the beginning around a case study, and, you know, you could pick Raj's area of anti-corruption as a flagship and really do a wonderful co-design project that looks at the general, but also the particular, looks at the way laws travel or don't travel across cultures and jurisdiction. And that could be fantastic, drawing on the expertise of multiple universities and having these courses recognized in different institutions. That could be the emergence of a transnational curriculum.
Thank you, Professor Bronitt. That is actually an excellent strategy. We are actually working on a number of grant proposals for co-designing courses with different universities, so that is excellent. I think for the next question, we can club question 5 and question 6 together. And it is, how do we ensure that principles of equity, inclusion, and social justice are maintained while striving towards a global legal education? And how can we maintain these equitable engagements between law schools that do not reproduce global hegemonic patterns? So I think, Professor Tan, do you want to go ahead?
Right, thank you. Well, as far as question 5 is concerned, I personally actually don't really see this as an issue, because I think whether we strive towards a global legal education or not, all these particular perspectives are embedded in the courses we teach and how we teach. I think the real danger, and I think Michael's really alluded to this, is that law schools fail to properly balance the need for efficiency and results on the one hand with the right culture and ethos that universities ought to have. And part of this is because of ranking systems and all this. And I would also say that I don't personally think that I've seen very much hegemonic patterns as far as law schools are concerned. I think, as opposed to nation states, of course. I mean, I think it is true that many scholars from more developed countries, particularly from the West, tend to dominate international conferences and all this. But I think it's partly a function of their familiarity with the English language. More to do also with coming from more developed jurisdictions that exposed to greater jurisprudence, and perhaps a little bit of insensitivity on the part of all law professors who always want to be heard more than to listen more. But in terms of institutional hegemonism, I really don't see any. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tan. Professor Stuckey.
I've got to respond to that, so thanks. Yeah, I think this is a real risk. I really do, and I know what Professor Tan is saying, and these things are not quite so overt. I mean, I don't think we actually see, consciously articulated hegemony. Of course not. To the contrary, we see consciously articulated attempts to, promote diversity, promote inclusiveness, all of those things. But unfortunately, I think a lot of that can often resolve itself as a kind of level of rhetoric, and underneath that, these pressures. And I use the word pressures because I don't think it's conscious intent. I think it's a trap that we've fallen into. So yeah, things like ranking systems, how on earth did we, get ourselves into that terrible trap? But we do, and we have. And, I've mentioned some of those things about commodification, about, government assumptions about how we behave. So, that's what I think the risk is. That the risk is that we say all the nice stuff, but we too easily lapse into that groove, which can be quite negative, and we've got to guard against that and consciously do so.
Thank you, Professor Stuckey. Professor Sangroula, your views on the...
Yes, I have a very, very brief answer to this again, with the example that what we do in Himalayan Phil school program, students come from Sydney, totally agreeing to Professor Simon, we write the curriculum together. From Sydney, they think of more global issues, and we in Nepal think more local issues, and we blend and we teach together. This is the best model. We two professors go together, like David and I go to the class, and we're talking about brick clean in Nepal. And then there is a IMF perspective, global World Bank perspective, Asian development perspective, how they are degenerating environment, how they are sponsoring big projects, and how they are not letting people to participate in that. And then I tell what is the problem, like from the Nepal's constitutions and their human rights and eventually we come to a certain conclusion, which Nepalese students benefits a lot, and the Sydney University. And the best thing is like by 2 weeks in, they become so integrate with each other, they become friends, they start crying to separate. And we, from last time, we stopped doing farewell because too much crying. This is what is globalization, and this is what is the fantastic inclusion. And this program has really encouraged the people's participation in a project like big drinking water project, we call it Melamchi, funded by Asian Development Bank. Lot of corruptions and other, and we have been able to bring these issues out to the notice of the world also. So that's how people are so happy. They keep asking us like when they are going to come again. It's a kind of thing. So this is, I think, the best way of inclusion for me.
Thank you, Professor Sangroula. That's an excellent example of contextualizing a global curriculum. Now we can have Professor Bronitt, your views on this question.
Look, in some senses, you know, the partnerships that we're choosing to prioritize are really significant, and you know, Jindal is the top of our list. I'm not sure it would have been necessarily otherwise, frankly. That's not a criticism of my predecessors, but if I look at generally who Sydney and many of the Group of 8 law schools, Russell Group, it's a club, and they tend to be circulating around Oxbridge, and we've got fantastic pathways, and you know, we've even got local scholarships to send students to Oxford to do the BCL. We fund that through scholarships. So there's a very set pattern, and that's the hegemony of Ivy League. We have a staff student exchange with Harvard. We've got a PhD student that's just come back. That's fantastic, you know. But it's really important that that we ensure that this isn't just an exclusive elite. So the question is making sure that we engage and prioritize participation. That filters down also to the types of students that can afford these globalization experiences. And I've been very attentive, like you, Arpita, to apply for grants for students. So we have a new Colombo Plan program. Sydney didn't bother doing it for a long while because our students could afford to fund it themselves. And that instantly irritated me, because I knew that what that meant is that students who couldn't afford to fund it themselves didn't even bother applying. So one of the important things that I've done is made sure that essentially we have won this round, because I made sure David put in an application, David Kinley, so that a wider group of students, not just those that essentially are privileged and affluent, can do it. So I do think it is important that we examine I do agree that there are set patterns that can be quite exclusive, that they are meritocratic in a way, but they're also quite, without the means, you're excluding people who would really benefit from these programs. I think it's very important that our First Nations peoples in our various, and this extends to India. I've just admitted a student from Mizoram who is one of the minority groups in India into one of our programs on a full scholarship, because I know how it's also one of the poorest in India. She was the first to graduate from that province in one of the national law schools. You know, you can choose in your institution to prioritize different types of opportunity. And I think it is that point about a pursuit of social justice, respect for First Nations, Indigenous peoples is really important. And I like to see it in Jindal, as I like to see it in Sydney and elsewhere, So yeah, look, I think there's an important mission to address global inequalities.
Thank you, Professor Bronitt. So we are actually receiving a lot of questions from the audience, and a lot of those questions have already been answered. And so these questions pertain to strategy, etc. And you have answered these questions well. So I think we can end the session, and we would like to thank our panelists for such a riveting discussion and our audience for their participation in this session. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you.